Well, last weekend, I shared stories with you about the way that God's grace is greater. And we talked about real life situations that people were facing: infidelity, suicide, addiction, and more. And we saw that God's grace really can carry someone through and move them to a new place in life. To me, those four people were braver than hell. The story I'm going to start with tonight is equally true and not nearly as serious. So, about a month ago, I was with my son and we were preparing to pull out of our subdivision. I was running really, really late and was in a hurry, but needed to make a stop at Home Depot on my way. Now, when you pull out of our subdivision, we pull out onto an extremely busy two-lane road that's kind of regularly packed with traffic, and I was in such a hurry, I knew I was going to have to gun it and unfortunately probably cut someone off. I looked, I thought I saw an opening, and so I did. I made a left-hand turn across some traffic and in between some traffic, and I got into the lane. I looked in front of me, and I noticed that the car in front of me had its flashers on. And then I looked in my rearview mirror, and I noticed that the car behind me had its flashers on. And I realized that I just pulled into a funeral procession. Yeah. There's a lot of things that run through your mind when you pull into a funeral procession. One of which is, should I turn my flashers on? But I didn't have very much time to process this. I knew that just about a half a mile down the road, I was going to need to make another left-hand turn. And that was going to be a problem because the traffic was continuously coming at me, and there was no way for the traffic that was behind me to get around me if I stopped. And I thought, I'm going to separate this funeral procession. And so I did what I would do. And I once again cut across traffic really hard to get out of their way and made my way to Home Depot. I looked in my rearview mirror just to make sure the rest of the procession wasn't following me to Home Depot. I was telling this story to our staff a couple of weeks ago, and Aaron Arklin on our staff said, yeah, they probably would have gone to Home Depot and thought, you know, he really did like Home Depot. And I had my son in the car, which, creates all kinds of interesting conversations. I thought, as you might think, I almost want to look in my rearview mirror and see somebody flipping me off, because I totally deserve it. And I'm driving down the road after I had gotten out of the procession. I'm talking to my son. And I'm beating myself up a little bit, and my son's sitting there saying, "Dad, it's okay." Like he's comforting me along the way. That story, it's kind of a weird story, isn't it? Because you all just laughed about me pulling into a funeral procession. And I think in maybe an odd way, maybe in an important way, it shines light on how we deal with situations when someone's guilty. Now, in this case, I was guilty. But in all the situations you could think of, and I could think about myself, we usually run our mind through a grid when we realize something's been done wrong. Sometimes we will only judge ourselves not based on our actions, but just our intentions. I didn't mean to pull in to a funeral procession, so I might let myself off the hook. Actually, apparently all of you like me enough that you judged me by my intentions, and you let me off the hook. You can judge yourself by your intentions and pay no attention to your actions or their consequences, or you can judge yourself by your actions. Or you can judge yourself by the consequences, the offense that actually takes place. We all have the proclivity to lean one direction or another, either to let ourselves off the hook too easily or potentially to beat ourselves up over something. It would be very interesting to say, when you've done something wrong, what's your posture toward making it right? Do you think in terms of thinking of what you could do, what you should do, what you will do? And one of the things that's very interesting to me is to ask yourself, honestly, when I'm in the same situation next time, will I make a different decision? Or will I actually just make the same decision again? Today we're going to talk about guilt. It's not necessarily a fun subject, but just to put it in the right context, I want to start with the same verse that I started with last week about the grace of God. Here's what the command is to me. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up. It's my role in your life, and I hope your role in other people's lives, to make sure everyone knows about the grace of God, that no one misses out on the grace of God. No one falls short of experiencing the grace of God, because a lot of people live in guilt, and the reason that they live there and become bitter is because they fell short of experiencing the grace of God. Now, when I talk about my guilt today and your guilt, I need you to know that we're going to have an honest and candid conversation about it, and where we're going to get to in the end is a promise that God's grace is greater than your guilt. I'm a pastor. One of the subjects that I talk with people about most frequently is about their guilt. I hesitate to say this, but it's probably true. I'm actually kind of an expert in dealing with guilt, leading people through guilt. You have a different job. You're an electrician. You're a stockbroker. You're a surgeon. You're a chef. I don't know what you are. You have parts of your job and you think, I know how to do these. Most people don't know how to do this. I know how to do this. I look at something, I can assess it, and I can help fix it. Some of you, isn't this true in your job? You'll come up on, let's say you're an electrician, you'll come up on a job of some shoddy work, and you'll look at it and you'll think, either someone tried to do this themselves and they didn't have the skills, or it was actually someone from my line of work who now I'm so frustrated that they handled it like that. And actually, that's one of the challenges about a conversation about guilt in a church setting like this, is that I know I'm not starting at a starting line with many of you. You've had experiences with people like me in settings like this that may have potentially done one of two things with guilt. Either they weaponized it, and they actually knew that they could make you feel guilty, and they knew that gave them some power over you, some manipulation, an ability to make you feel a certain way, and they pressed that button as often as they could. You had a guilt-laden religious experience. Or potentially you came across a leader, spiritual leader of some sort, who was completely dismissive and wanted to suggest to you that you should just forget about all the things that you've done wrong and move on in life without any real process of working through that. And when I come upon people who have had one of those two experiences, I look at it and I think somebody's done some shoddy work. Somebody's used guilt to their advantage, or they've dismissed the power of the things that we do wrong in our lives, and neither one of them is all that helpful. And so I want to help you today do a little bit of a self-assessment. Most of us don't handle our guilt in the most healthy ways possible. And so chances are you live on a spectrum on one side of how you deal with guilt or the other. I'll call it one end being obsessive about your guilt, and the other side being dismissive of your guilt. Now, I want to ask you, by the time I'm done describing this, to actually mark where you are on this. And if you want to mark the perfect middle because you're the perfect person, feel free. But chances are you live on one side of this or the other. I made myself a few notes. I actually want to read these a little bit because this will help put you on one side or the other. People who are obsessive about their guilt, they kind of feel this way about themselves. They'd say, I'm really bad. I've really messed up. People who are dismissive about their guilt will say, I'm not that bad. Which one are you? People who are obsessive about their guilt say, I'm stuck. I'm stuck in my sinfulness, in my wrongness. I'm stuck there. People who are dismissive of their guilt say this. They say, they don't actually say this, they just live this way. I'm content with my current level of sinfulness. I want to poke on this for just a moment. And I want to ask you, is that sentence possibly true of you? That you've just become content with your current level of sinfulness. That you stopped, and maybe it was long ago, doing hard work internally to keep becoming more and more like Christ. And you just settled that in and kind of figured this is probably the best I'm going to get. Better than most. That's dismissive. Obsessive people walk around with feelings of guilt. They just carry those feelings with them everywhere that they go. And dismissive people walk around with feelings of pride. And chances are you live on one side or the other of this spectrum. I want you to feel your guilt a little bit tonight, and I don't need to help the people who are obsessive to feel their guilt. But if you happen to be dismissive, maybe this quote will convict you like it convicted me. It's from Tim Keller. He says, if you have a small view of your sin, then God's grace will be small to you. And if you've ever been able to sit through a message about God's grace and think, I guess that's nice, but it doesn't seem like that big a deal. I'm trying to teach you today that the reason for that is you haven't come to terms with how big of a deal your sinfulness really is. Last week I glazed past a story in John chapter 8 where there was a woman who was caught in adultery. I want to dive in just a little bit further on it. I'm going to pick up the story at this spot. Some town leaders, teachers of the law, actually religious leaders, had caught this woman, apparently a man, in the act of adultery. They drug her out, they let him go away, and they put her in front of the judges. They all stand in the square. They say, Jesus, do you know what the Old Testament says? It says this is a capital crime. And they all picked up their rocks, their stones, to be prepared to stone her, to give her the capital punishment. And Jesus knelt down and started to write things in the dirt or in the sand. And then this conversation kind of emerges. I want you to see that this story is actually about more than just the woman. Here's how it goes. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. She was standing in the middle of town. Probably just had a bed sheet wrapped around her. Probably had her head dropped. She knew her guilt. The question was, could they see their own? And the work that Jesus had to do with someone who had been dismissive or a little prideful was to say, hey, I'm going to actually ask you to do a little work of your own, to look inside yourself. Is it that you're not guilty? And upon that prompting, the people who had been so prideful, so judgmental toward others, had no choice but to drop their rocks. Say, it's true of me as well. This is how that goes. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard him began to go away, one at a time. The older ones first. Isn't that so interesting? The older ones first. I don't know if that's about maturity or about wisdom or about realization or about more people probably knew about all the stuff they had done. But the older ones first, and then they had to kind of led the younger ones to walk away. Until Jesus was left with the woman standing there. It goes on. Jesus straightened up and he asked her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And you can kind of just picture her, can't you, holding that sheet across her body. Her head had been down. She had not even perhaps seen them walk away, and she lifts her eyes, and she says, no one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus said. Now, go and leave your life of sin. This is a powerful story about her, someone who is carrying so much guilt, who was caught in the act. But that same phrase, I mean, maybe Jesus tried to say it loud enough so the people who were walking away could hear it too. Now go and leave your life of sin. That's powerful. Later on, the Apostle Paul would try to describe the effect of God's grace in our lives. If you want to do, like if you're an academic and you think, I really want to dive into the academic side and explanation of what grace is, you should just read Romans chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's a beautiful, beautiful summation of the theology of God's grace. But let me just piece two phrases together that capture it all. Starting in Romans 3:23, it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The woman who committed adultery had sinned. The man who she committed it with had sinned, even though he wasn't present. Every person who was around holding a rock had sinned. It's all. And when we have a healthy view of this, you and I have the chance to do some really important internal work about us and God, to acknowledge our guilt. And then here's the promise. It says, and where sin increased, grace increased all the more. Where sin increased, for people who had stacked sin upon sin upon sin, for people who had the worst of sins, for all of that, wherever sin increased, God's grace increased all the more. Grace was always greater than sin. Now, I want to do something interactive in the room here for just a moment. I don't usually do this, but we're going to have some fun. How about this? I need 5 volunteers to join me right here on the platform, like in the next 10 seconds. I need 3 of them to be women and 2 of them to be guys, okay? Go. You can come up either side of the platform. I need 2 guys. I need 3 women. 2 guys and 3 women. Here's a guy. Here's a woman. I need you to come all the way up here with me. All the way up. Yep. I would recommend the steps. Okay, never mind. So we got 2 guys. I need 2 more women. Come on. I need 2 more women. Who's gonna? There's one. I just need 1 more. 1 more woman. I feel like an auctioneer here. Thank you, Megan, for coming up. All right. So I need you to line up. Here's what I want to do. Danny, I want you to stand right here.
Yes.
Okay. Need one of the ladies right here. Right here. I need a lady here. Oh, this is good. Megan, you're released. You get to go sit down. I don't even need you. You're good. I got 5. All right, now I'm going to name these people for you, okay? So your name, I'm going to give you new names. Your name is Teresa, okay? Your name is Arlene, okay? Your name is Joe. It is? It actually is. That's kind of weird. Your name is Tracy. And your name is Adolf.
We did this last time and I was Adolf.
Huh.
All right.
So, let me give you their last names. This is Adolf Hitler.
Perfect.
I'm going to reserve a last name here. This is Tracy, my ex-girlfriend from high school.
You got stories to tell.
Tracy, we dated for about a year, and then Tracy went to prison. And that's the truth. All of you who are unhappy with who your children are dating right now, you're like, maybe it'll be okay. It's all going to work out. This is Joe. He's in the middle because he's just an average Joe. This is Arlene. Arlene is my grandmother. And I had an awesome grandmother. She was kind, she was sweet, she was awesome, she was a great cook, all that. As awesome as she was no Mother Teresa. Now, I've lined up for you here across the platform a spectrum of what we would think of as morality, right? Everyone from Adolf Hitler to Mother Teresa and everyone in between. And chances are you can quite quickly assign for yourself where you fall in terms of how good of a person you are. I'm wildly fascinated by where you assign yourself right now. And let me just comment on a few of the places where people might assign themselves. My guess is that none of you assign yourself here. Adolf Hitler was a horrible human being. The thing I need you to know about Adolf Hitler is that after he had been responsible for cleansing the earth of millions of people, if instead of choosing suicide, he had turned to the God of the universe and asked for forgiveness, God would forgive him. Because God's grace is greater than anything. I've had conversations with people this week, and they don't know they're making a theological statement when they make it, and then I get the chance to correct them after they make it. But people will flippantly say something like, "Oh man, God's grace is amazing, but grace has its limits." I'm just telling you, grace doesn't have limits. I'm guessing that almost none of you put yourself in Mother Teresa. I mean, you wouldn't even be here, right? You'd be in Calcutta. Mother Teresa is a unique person. People who are like Mother Teresa actually aren't there because they're prideful. They have a hyper-awareness of the brokenness of this world, including their own. They know of God's grace and mercy, and their response is to live a life that tries to change the world. Chances are most of us live in this range. If you feel like you're like my grandma, better than most, or kind of an average Joe, definitely better than those people, one of the things you'll be quite prone to do is to think you're fine. I mean, nobody expects you to be Mother Teresa, right? And so you can walk with the dismissive notion of life. You can kind of skate over. You can judge yourself by your intentions rather than your actions. You can settle into your current level of sinfulness and be content. And some of you feel like you're here, that you've done something really, really wrong. And you know it wasn't like that, but you know that most people are better than you. And I think this crowd is in the story with Jesus. Where are you? You guys can all sit down. Thank you very, very much. Now, when you can start to say, yeah, that's where I am, and how do I then handle that? Basically, you have two choices. You have the choice to say, I'm going to handle this myself. I'll clean up my life. I'll get on the live a better life plan, and I'll try to be a better person. Or you can step back and say, I need the grace of God. And so, very briefly, I want to give you one more grid for you to think through and to maybe make an assessment of how you've tried to handle this before and paint a picture of how God invites you to handle this wherever you are. For the distinction is really, do you think this comes from yourself or does it come from God? And you can think about it this way. Let me give you some ideas. If you think it comes from yourself, then most of you live on the do plan. But if it comes from God, that means it's done. Do means I have to earn it. That if I'm going to be a good person, it's kind of up to me, and I need to straighten out my life, and then I always think I have to do something better. I have to be a better person. But the message of the gospel is that God loved you so much that he sent his son into the world. His son died on the cross, and the work to relieve you from your sinfulness and your guilt is done. It's not dependent on your effort. It's not a cleanup job on aisle 9. It is the cross. And one of the things I try to gently but strongly talk to people about who feel like they're wallowing in an old sin, something they can't overcome, is that I have to ask them, was the cross not enough? Did God need to do something more? Did Jesus need to pay a greater price? It's done. People who are doing it themselves always think in terms of behavior and behavior modification. People who understand that it's a gift from God think about the level of their motivations. This is essentially a distinction between people who pay attention to their externals and their actions, and people who start to pay attention to the internals and let God do a work inside of their heart. Because it's when you allow God to do the work inside of your heart and you encounter the grace of God that it retools something from the inside that will lead to better actions rather than just gritting your teeth and trying to be better. A lot of times this can be cast in terms of people who think about rules versus people who think about relationship. Last weekend I was wanting to catch somebody in our church, so I texted them on Saturday and I said, hey, could I have 5 minutes with you after the service on Sunday? And they said yes, and then they met me in the commons area on Sunday. And when they walked up to me, they had this look in their eye like, I'm in trouble. And they weren't in trouble. I had something very nice and encouraging to say to them. At the end of the conversation, the person said, whew, it's kind of like getting called to the principal's office. That made me think a few things, like what vibe am I giving off about myself that makes it feel like the principal's office? But even more so, I think this is the posture people have toward God. Say if it's about the rules and he probably caught you doing something wrong, then when you encounter God, you think you're going to experience condemnation. But if you know who God is, that he loves you and he welcomes you and he actually wants to walk with you and cleanse you and free you, that's out of a relationship because he loves you. Many people experience this as frustration. People who are on the do-it-myself plan, they're trying to do it out of self-discipline. If I was just better, if I was just stronger inside, if I was just more disciplined, then I could stop doing that, or I could start doing this. And then you fail, and then you beat yourself up, and it's kind of this miserable cycle. But instead of frustration, the grace of God, when it comes from God, he gives you a freedom that you can't give yourself. Last weekend when Aaron was describing 20 years of addiction and now 10 years of freedom, you have to ask yourself, what changed? What changed? And the answer to that is the grace of God rushed in, and it was liberating and freeing. This is also powerful because many people think about their sin and their relationship with God, or maybe their potential to go to heaven, and they think that it has something to do with how many sins they've committed, or whether they said their prayers that night and asked forgiveness for every single sin, and what if they go one sin too far, or what if they commit a sin they didn't commit, or they didn't confess. And people get real hung up on these things. But knowing that it's a relationship means that I live under the umbrella of the grace of God, and I don't have to walk on eggshells through life wondering about the last thing that I did wrong. It's not there to be taken advantage of, but it is there to be appreciated, which is actually the last distinction. People who are on the on my own plan either end up with guilt or pride. The obsessive people end up with guilt. The dismissive people end up with pride. But the people who have said, no, it's not up to me. I'm welcoming the grace of God in my life. I'm seeing my identity through who he is. I'm accepting what his son did for me. It just breeds this overwhelming gratitude that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And you get to walk not in guilt or not in pride, but in gratitude in your posture toward the rest of the life. Ephesians 2 says it exactly like this. This is why I made these distinctions. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And so I want to ask each one of you right now to think about your sinfulness. I want to move beyond the niceties of, well, nobody's perfect. And take ownership of the things that you've done wrong. For some of you, your mind will immediately go to something horrible that you've done. And maybe you've just kept carrying that with you all the way through life up until today. For some of you, your mind will go to a habit that you have. And you wish you could stop, but you've tried to stop and you can't stop, and it's got you, and you know it's not right. Some of you will go to a secret because guilt loves to live in the dark. And you hide it from anyone you can hide it from. But you know it lives there. And some of you, I'm hoping that this experience actually softens your heart so that you feel some guilt. And stop thinking of yourself as a person who's better than most or kind of has it taken care of. And if I could stand with each one of you and put my hands on your shoulders and look you in the eye one by one tonight, this is what I would say. I would say, God's grace is greater. It's greater than your sin. It's greater than your shame. And it's greater than your secrets. Now, over the next 7 minutes or so, we're going to lead through an encounter in this room. First, I'm going to lead you in a prayer of confession. And as I lead you through that prayer, I want you to have in mind where you're not right with God. After that prayer of confession, we're going to listen to a song. And I want you to let that song embed itself in your heart and let the Spirit have its power. And then we're going to share in communion, where in its fullness we encounter the cross. And we remember that God's grace is sufficient to cover anything you've done wrong. So I'll ask you to close your eyes and bow your head right now. And I'm going to lead us through 4 sentences of a prayer. If you are a follower of Jesus, or tonight if you want to become a follower of Jesus, right in this moment, these words are for you. If you're not a follower of Jesus, all I can ask is that you consider what these words might mean in real life. Let's pray together. God, we are guilty. And I don't hesitate to ask God right now that you bring to mind and bring to the surface what we're guilty of. We say this to you, God. We are guilty. God, we need you. We need you, God. A lot of us for a long time have tried to do the fix it on my own plan, and we're saying today that we can't fix it. That we need you. God, your grace is greater than our guilt. In this moment, God, no matter what we have done, no matter what horrible choices we have made, no matter what's in our past or what we are hiding, help us all to know that your grace is greater than our guilt. And God, right now we receive your grace. We ask that it floods into us. We give up the fighting and we lay down our efforts and we say, it's you, God. We receive it in the name of your Son, Jesus. And God, we are grateful. That this grace is not just momentary for today, but the grace we experience now will be with us tomorrow and in all the days to come. God, when the ugliness of our lives comes to mind, and it will, I pray you draw us back to this moment where we receive